their recent book on autocratic mentality. We were just discussing it a bit before we started this webinar. And so today, by the way, I started recording right now. Today we have a third edition of our webinars where I suggest indeed, we reflect on something that is, I think, extremely topical. We're all aware of what is going on in the United States, a country that has classically been seen by, for instance, political scientists as one of the most important and robust democracies in the world. It's clearly rapidly eroding as we speak. And to link this indeed with the concern we all have, that is democracy, how can we relate our interest in an innovative democracy, in citizens' assemblies, but then also in other forms of democracy? And some of our speakers, I think, today will reflect on this, also direct democracy, for instance, other forms of participatory democracy. How can they, in one way or the other, help sustaining, let's say, the democratic project? I've been a bit rude. I haven't introduced myself yet, but my name is Paul Blokker. I'm a professor in political sociology at the University of Bologna. I coordinate the CitiDem project, which is funded by SURF money. It's a project that is part of a larger European endeavor, a kind of transnational or pan-European civil society coalition, Citizens Take Over Europe. And in our CitiDem project, we are, on the one hand, organizing our own assemblies. We just had one in Brussels a couple of weeks ago, a transnational assembly, but then we have a whole range of city-based assemblies. I will put some of the links to our project in the chat in a second. And the attempt is indeed to be both organizing these assemblies and at the same time reflect on and learn from assemblies. And I think the important part of the CitiDem project is that it's clearly a project of two universities and for the rest civil society partners. And so these are all in many ways bottom-up types of assemblies. They're not directly necessarily linked to institutions or indeed to political parties or anything else. And so today we are going to discuss in a more reflective and a critical mode, I suppose, the role of citizens' assemblies in times of emerging populism and authoritarianism. I'm really very happy that we have our two speakers, Nenad Stojanović, I will introduce you properly later on, closer to your talk, and Kristof Jacobs, the same. I'm really happy also because we never met in person, I suppose, at least I don't recall. And so this is a wonderful way to at least get to know each other a little bit. Before we start with your two talks, just a couple of remarks on the sort of the house rules of this event. So the webinar will consist in two talks, first by Nenad and then by Kristof, related to their research on citizens' assemblies and populism. As I already stated before, we decided, as we did in the other webinars as well, to turn audio and video of participants off. I hope that's not a problem. You do have access to the chat, so commenting, questions, etc. is more than welcome. We see a little bit maybe how many people are still online after the presentations. Maybe we can open the whole thing up during Q&A. I just wouldn't like to have disruptions, etc. during the presentations. I remember everyone that the webinar is being recorded, and the idea is to make it public on our CitiDem YouTube channel. I will put the links in the chat later. On that channel, you can already find the seminar with Urbinati and Lafont on autocratic mentality. So let's get started. Our first speaker is indeed Nenad Stojanović, who is also going to be a visiting researcher, if I'm not mistaken, in Bologna soon, right? So we can meet up. He's currently indeed an associate professor of political science at the University of Geneva. also research at the Center of Democracy Studies, ARAO, at the University of Zurich. He studied political science in all kinds of places, Geneva, Paris, London, Montreal, Zurich again, PhD from the Zurich University, working on representation, minority rights, particularly in the context of multicultural types of democracies. I think he used once the term ethnocracy, which is definitely interesting. But he has also great expertise on citizens' assemblies, not least in relation to direct democracy. There's this really interesting handbook with Grutter, where he has a chapter, and Kristof Jacobs, by the way, has also a chapter, so that's much recommended. And if I understood it correctly, Nenad has also ample experience with organizing, as far as I can see, also kind of bottom-up citizens' assemblies, right, in this association in Switzerland called Demoscan. So, yeah, I'm really excited that you're with us, and I'm very curious about what you're going to tell us. I will give you the floor. You have around 20 minutes. We don't need to be too rigid, but I'm not sure if you want to share a PowerPoint. Okay, so please go ahead. The screen is yours, as we might say.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Hello, everyone. Okay, so what is this? Okay. Thanks for the invitation, Paul. It's a great project, CitiDem, and a great round of webinars you've been organizing. Okay, as a disclaimer, as usual, when we talk in Zoom and we don't know everybody who is in the room. We don't know actually, what do you know about direct democracy, mini publics, etc. But I suppose that the average knowledge is still quite high. So please excuse me if I say some things that are too obvious for some of them, for some of you, but perhaps for some other people it's less obvious. So I will try to do the best I can. I also decided, by discussing this briefly with Paul and Kristof, that I will start with a discussion about direct democracy and populism first, and then in the last part of my presentation turn to citizen assemblies or mini publics and how do they connect with both populism and direct democracy. Let's see if I will succeed. So, very, very general, few words. When I say populism, I mean it's very minimal definition where there are two core elements. Populist movements and leaders are, of course, anti-elitist, but also anti-pluralist. And it is this combination of the two that can be problematic for liberal democracy, as we actually see as we speak. Paul used this expression in one of the oldest democracies in the world. The anti-elitist part of it is not necessarily problematic. There are people who have written about that, but again, it's the combination of the two. It is in the context of this rise of populism and the connected idea that democracies are in crisis that there has been a quest for more direct democracy. And again, let me clarify what I mean by direct democracy. I don't mean the ancient kind of Greek democracy where people would gather on the square and vote by raising hands, but the rather modern kind of direct democracy where actually the representative institutions, parliaments are complemented by referendums and, or let's say popular votes on referendums and citizens' initiative. And if we think about direct democracy connected to populism, especially asking, what can be an impact of a system based on this direct or semi-direct democracy on populism, we can see that in the literature, in the mainstream literature, direct democracy has been seen with a lot of suspicion, saying that it can be enabling for populism and therefore something that we should rather avoid. And actually, this point of view from many democratic theorists is also supported by the fact that almost all, if not all, populist movements in Europe, at least, in their platforms, one of the things that they, the kind of reforms that they propose is to have more direct democracy, more referendums in which the people can directly immediately say what they think on a given topic. So in a way, where I situate my work in the past years is a little bit against this mainstream, where I try to show that under certain conditions, direct democracy can also be non-enabling for populism. But there are some preconditions. The kind of direct democracy I have in mind is a bottom-up and not top-down one. Bottom-up means that in order to trigger a popular vote, either through citizens' initiatives, through which you can influence agenda setting, or through referendums through which you can block legislation or veto legislation by parliament. So it's not necessary to really collect citizen signatures instead of having simply referendums decided from above, like it's often the case in France. Every now and then there is a referendum, but it's usually the president who decides to hold the referendum. Or the example from Brexit, where the prime minister played the central role in actually triggering that popular vote. So that's not what I have in mind. Second, these citizens' signatures do have an impact. It's not like the European Citizens Initiative, an instrument that exists at the European Union level since the Lisbon Treaty, where you can, collect signatures, I think 1 million in about 8 countries, spread in 8 countries, and then you have this initiative, but it doesn't trigger a popular vote. This initiative is then can be discussed by the European Commission and voted by European Parliament. But in the end, if they refuse the reform proposal that is in that initiative, that's the end of the story. There is no popular vote at the EU level. So that's not what I have in mind. Third, very important, direct democracy is not used once every 10 or 15 years, as in France, as in the UK and other countries. Some other countries. But there's a frequent use of direct democracy, which means that the hurdles for triggering referendums or popular votes, generally speaking, should not be too high. And the topics cannot be, all the time big constitutional issues, but very often ordinary political issues. Topics like, do we want to build a new road or a new tunnel? What kind of health reform do we want? Or do we need some pension reform? Which are, things that are really important to ordinary citizens, but they are not like big constitutional issues. And fourth, there should be occasions for deliberation before the popular vote. So it's not simply by voting yes, no, without really having any kind of deliberation beforehand. There should be structured or institutionally structured occasions for people to deliberate before actually they express their preference for one or the other sides. This can also happen through mini publics. I will come to that later on. So if we think of these preconditions, we come up with one very important, in my view, a very important aspect, that this frequent use of this bottom-up direct democracy creates a situation of unstable majorities and minorities, meaning that every citizen, if she or he votes, is occasionally in the majority, but in other occasions in the minority. Actually, very often, at least here in Switzerland, I speak from Switzerland now, on a single day you might have 3, 4, 5 referendums, and you may win on 2 or 3 of them, but lose the other 2. That's something that happens all the time, and that's very important because the mainstream theorists of democracy see this as a disadvantage of direct democracy, whereas, in my opinion, it is crucial in this non-populist account because it does increase the likelihood that members, especially members of minorities, can also be part or will be part of political majorities on certain issues. So basically, you are never really completely minority or completely majority. You are in both camps. I would also like to mention here the concept of loser's consent. Briefly, I will not develop this. I don't have time for that. The importance that for the stability of democracy, that those who lose consent. And if you have a situation where you are frequently a loser and frequently a winner, this makes things also from this point of view easier. So the question is, how and why should this conception of direct democracy be non-populist? Well, a couple of ideas here. The first is that this frequent and regular use of direct democracy can structurally undermine the populist ideology, which is based on this non-pluralist conception of the people, as I said in one of the first slides, or the very first slide. So based on the idea that there is the will of the people, a unified will of something that is the people. We know that this idea of the people is a fiction in a way, but this fiction becomes, and this is a thesis I have, more readily apparent if actually this people can express its views, or not once every 10 or 15 years, but frequently. Because this makes it more apparent that, if a populist leader says, oh, I know what the people want, and the people want, less immigrants in this country. Well, you don't know what actually people want if you don't ask the people. And perhaps on some occasion, the people will confirm or the majority of voters, so to say, it will confirm what the populist says, but in many other occasions, that will not be the case. Let me continue. I also, in past writings, I've developed some kind of a couple of ideas about how this direct democracy can enhance the formation of a demos, so not people in an ethnic, of course, sense of the word, and actually help to bring about an idea that that this demos is a plural political community, which is very important to have a functioning democracy. Perhaps this it can bring about a conception of people which is closer to, for instance, Claude Lefort's idea that people should be seen as multiple, and he even says in French, infigurable, difficult to figure it out. Of course, there are many important institutional design details, which are not details, but they are very important to, like representative democracy, direct democracy also needs checks and balances. So there's, a debate, should there be a quorum for participation, for instance. Personally against it, but there are people who are in favor of it, like Italy has a 50% quorum in order to have a referendum valid. So at least 50% of those who have the right to vote should show up. Should there be some qualified majorities on certain issues or not? Should perhaps there be compulsory voting in order to increase turnout? Should there be some kind of constitutional court checking for the constitutional conformity of proposals or laws with the Constitution, which is something, by the way, that we do not have in Switzerland, and so on. But in the 10 minutes that I still have, I would like now to focus on one additional or possible check that could contribute to, let's say, making direct democracy robust against possible instrumentalizations from populism, which is to use mini publics or citizens assemblies Especially what I have in mind is the so-called Oregon model of many publics, called also Citizens Initiative Review, because it is a kind of citizens assembly that is directly connected with popular votes, with referendums. Again, I'm sure that many of you know what Citizens Initiative Review is, but very briefly, it is a kind of mini public that, of course, combines elements of deliberation, and the people are selected through sortition. But it is directly connected to referendums in a way that the topic of the deliberation in such a mini public is an upcoming popular vote, either referendum or citizens initiative. The randomly selected group of citizens have a certain amount of time, usually 2 weekends, to discuss, deliberate on that proposal, to see what are the main elements of it, what are the most relevant and fact-checked arguments against this proposal, and what are the most important arguments in favor of the proposal. And then at the end, there is a vote within the mini public to see what is the opinion of the majority on that particular topic. So it's in a way, I think, more ambitious than, let's say, traditional mini publics, deliberative polls or other kinds of mini publics, where the results, the recommendation of the assembly are, let's say, presented to decision makers, government, parliament, and then they decide what to do with that. Here, the final report, the statement of the mini public, according to this Oregon model, is a statement summarizing the various arguments in favor or against the proposal, and then this statement is then sent out to all voters in an official pamphlet, so that they can have an additional source of information on and make up their mind, or some kind of internal deliberation on actually what to vote on that referendum. So we started in Switzerland. Let's say we used this Oregon model for the first time in 2019. This was the very first mini public that we organized in Switzerland, and since then we've had a dozen of them at various levels of government. This was in a town of Sion, which is the capital of the canton of Valais or Valais. It was on a topic of a federal citizens initiative, which was on affordable housing. And that very first pilot triggered a huge interest among Swiss public administrations, especially in different municipalities, cantons, even at the federal level, so that up to date, there have been 2 additional Oregon model mini publics in the canton of Geneva, one in the canton of Aargau, one in the city of Bellinzona. So all of them were connected to a real referendum or popular vote on a citizens initiative. So these were not merely, let's say, academic experiments. So the statement was really sent to all citizens in the respective city or canton, of course, in collaboration with public authorities. Now, is there a non-populist potential in this kind of mini public? Well, I think there is. First, because generally speaking, there's the research on mini publics. Generally speaking, scholars or colleagues who were interested in seeing to what extent populist proposals, what happens with some populist proposals if they are given for debate to mini public, they have found out that generally speaking, such proposals receive less support at the end of deliberations than the support they can have at the beginning. Andre Becktiger, for instance, and colleagues have examined this on a topic of a Swiss referendum 2010, which was on the expulsion of the foreign criminals, which in the end did receive a slim majority of yes votes, and they did found out that within the experiment they have made, that the people in the mini public at the beginning were rather in favor of that, but towards the end they were against. Other people have also found similar results. So there's one hypothesis that if voters follow the recommendation of this mini public CIR or Oregon model, that there might be less risk that in the end they take a populist and potentially problematic for democracy decisions than without. This is a hypothesis at this stage. This hypothesis is unfortunately not so easy to test it right now, because the John Gastel and other people who have started organizing, or let's say accompanying these Oregon model mini publics in the US in the first years, they did use this information on how the mini public itself at the end of the deliberation voted on the topic, and they put that information as a last sentence in the statement. But later on, they thought that this sentence should not be there, that people should concentrate on arguments in favor or against, instead of simply reading the recommendation. We also have some potential legal issues, at least in the Swiss context. The collaboration with public authorities might have been more difficult if we included the sentence in the statements, but we did use it. We did use it for experimental purposes, because after some of our mini publics, we did some kind of survey experiment where one group of respondents would receive not only the statement but also the information about how the mini public itself actually voted on a specific proposal. And we do have some first hints that this hypothesis I put here, it goes in that direction, but it's really unfortunately too early for me that to tell you that this is, that hypothesis is confirmed. It would be I cannot affirm this at this stage. Yes. The hypothesis, of course, does also depend on the question: will voters follow this recommendation in the statement if we are allowed to put to include it in the final statement? Again, some research from John Gastel and his collaborators does go into this direction that it might be seen as a possible shortcut, but still, it's still open for debate. So let me, on this last note, thank you, because I think I used my time. But if there are any questions, I would be more than happy to address them in the QA later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nenad. That was really excellent and really thought-provoking. I think also in terms of my question would be immediately, to what extent can certain experience be transferred from one context to the other? But, let's first hear Kristof, and then we open the floor for Q&A, also for a certain way efficiency reasons. There's already a lot on the table. And I'm curious what we will hear from Kristof Jacobs, who's indeed an associate professor at the Department of Political Science at Nijmegen University in the Netherlands. His research is very much focusing on indeed challenges to democracy. He had various prestigious grants in the Dutch context on indeed democratic innovation and things like that. And he has also been the director of the Dutch National Referendum Study in 2016, 2018. And I particularly got to know his work, his more recent work, where he did analysis of what I think is a really interesting part of the story. That is, some make the distinction, like Bechtiger was already mentioned, between populist leaders and populist citizens, who are not the same. And there's still maybe I can sort of succinctly put it, there's still maybe a lot of hope in reaching populist citizens, maybe less so certain populist leaders. But he did a quite number of really interesting studies on this. So I would be really, I'm really happy to give Kristof the floor and to convey us your ideas and perspectives on populism and citizens' assembly. Please go ahead.
Right. Thank you, Paul. Thanks for hosting me. And indeed, this is something that we've been working on for quite some time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you 7 important findings of the research that we did regarding populism and democratic innovations. So the title of the presentation is Have a Little Faith in Deliberation, and I'll show you a quote later on that inspired this title. But basically, for the last 5 years, I've been doing a lot of research into how populist citizens specifically deal with deliberation, both in participatory budgeting and in citizens' assemblies. So this is something that I've been doing in collaboration with a lot of colleagues of mine, Rosa Kind, Marie Theus, Caroline Van Ham, Robert Huber, Nisa van Dijk, and Stella Koenen, which I would like to explicitly mention because doing this kind of research involves a lot of grunt work, going to these actual citizens' assemblies, handing out paper surveys, digitalizing them, doing interviews. It's a lot of work, so they deserve to be mentioned explicitly. So the starting point of this research was actually some time ago with the protests of the Yellow Vests and the Yellow Vest movement in France. And one of their aims or one of their demands was to organize something that became the Citizens Assembly, the Climate Citizens Assembly in France. And the interesting thing is that that example kind of like spread like wildfire all over Western Europe. And according to NOCA, the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies, if you look at their map, I think almost all of the Western European countries now had a national citizens assembly, with the exception of Belgium. And in the Netherlands currently we are having one. I'm responsible for the research into this. I don't have the data yet because it's still taking place. But the most important question that triggered me at that time was, okay, so we have this idea that democratic innovations such as the citizens' assemblies can counteract populism among citizens. And this is also nicely illustrated by this title by a recent book by André Bechtiger and John Rysick, Deliberative Democracy for Diabolical Times, Confronting Populism, Extremism, Denial, and Authoritarianism. And this idea that if you just treat populist citizens with deliberation, this will cure their populism, basically. And this is not a new idea. In fact, if you go back in time to one of the godmothers of the populism field of research, Canavan, there is this fantastic quote in one of her early studies. I'll read it for you. There is certainly a large dose of redemptive faith intermingled with the rationalism of most theories of deliberative or discursive democracy. Faith in the transforming power of deliberation, and faith that if the people at the grassroots were just to be exposed to it, their opinions would be transformed in the correct anti-populist direction. This is a fantastic quote, and that is also the reason why I titled this presentation, Faith in Deliberation. Because the fascinating thing is, in fact, that even though this quote is from 1999, scientifically speaking, we basically still lack a lot of important knowledge about this. First of all, theoretically speaking, we don't really know how and why that effect would materialize. Let alone empirically, does the effect actually materialize? I mean, the funny thing is that that book that I mentioned, Deliberative Democracy for Diabolical Times, they quote our research on participatory budgeting, because at the time of the writing of the book, there was no research available on deliberative democracy. So this is really fascinating that even though we are 26 years later, there's still not a lot of research. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 7 findings of the research that we did, where we try to basically close both of these gaps, or at least offer a starting point for that. The main research question that we had in that research project is very very much linked to that. To what extent, if at all, does participation in a deliberative process change populism among citizens? Do populist citizens, or citizens with a high degree of populist attitudes, do they become less populist? Do we see a backlash effect? Do they become even more populist? Or do people with low degree of populist attitudes actually become infected, so to speak, and become more populist? These are important questions. So to get things out of the way, I first want to give you the definitions that we used in the project. Now, these are not uncontroversial. When you speak of populism, there's a lot of definitions out there. Interestingly speaking, they tend to center on the main things, basically. The good people versus the corrupt elite, whereby the populist has these glasses on, a lens, that views reality in very black and white terms. So the elite is bad, it is corrupt, and the people are good, they are morally superior, basically. And not just that, the people, the common people, they have common sense, they have wisdom, and they don't need, for instance, bookish knowledge. They by themselves already are fully formed, and they know what they want. So that is populism. There's a little bit of debate about what populism is. Is it a strategy, a communication style? Is it a set of ideas? But that is the kind of debate that is mostly relevant when we discuss populist parties. Because I think that there is an argument to be made that it's not necessarily a principled position of parties, but rather an electoral strategy to win votes. This is especially visible when, for instance, the populism collides with the other policy issues, such as anti-immigration. And there you see that the populism suddenly disappears at the expense of this anti-immigration stuff. Regarding deliberation, that's another very contested concept, perhaps not in this kind of crowd, but basically we view it as a mode of participation whereby you have equal participation, listening, mutual respect, basically a very pluralist way of having a good discussion. And I think that captures the gist of it. Now, if you link these two concepts together, let's start with deliberation and the potential of deliberation. In fact, there's a lot of research and there's also a lot of theoretical thinking about the potential of deliberation, specifically regarding its positive impact on political attitudes, such as the potential that it has to increase political interest, to increase the political self-efficacy, the internal efficacy of citizens, whereby they think or they believe or become confident that they are capable of dealing with political issues. And all of the elements of deliberation theoretically are linked to a positive effect on political attitudes, because the citizens then view that they are taken seriously, not only by other citizens, but also by the elites who organize these citizens' assemblies. And it opens them up to the policy process. They get more respect for the difficulties and the complexities of the process. And that, in essence, is said to have a positive effect on political attitudes. I'm going to show you some empirical data later on, whereby indeed it turns out to be the case that it has a positive effect on political attitudes. Now, one of these political attitudes is populism, populist attitudes. And since 2014, there's actually quite a burgeoning literature on populism among citizens. There's been done a lot of work on how to measure populism among citizens. And we also know a lot of the correlates of populist attitudes, the things that they go together with. So, for instance, citizens with a higher degree of populist attitudes tend to be very much vocal about politics. They want to be heard and also tend to be very interested in politics. Now, if you link that to deliberation, it turns out that some of the populist elements actually may have a positive link with deliberation, but others have a negative link. So that's why I labeled it an uneasy relationship. So yes, deliberation gives populist citizens the opportunity to be heard, not just by politicians, but also by their fellow citizens. And that's something that they value deeply. Also, the mere fact of organizing a citizens' assembly sends the message that politicians are interested in them. On the other hand, populism is already about a fully formed opinion. So why on earth do we need deliberation? It is not needed because the people already know what they want. They are a homogeneous whole. And then secondly, specifically when it comes to citizens' assemblies, there's a dose of information and expertise involved. Now, you might remember that quote from Michael Gove during the campaign on Brexit. The people have had enough of experts. I don't believe that. And that is because in the populist worldview, that is a black and white worldview, it is probably better to speak of their experts and our experts, the good ones who understand the people and the bad ones who don't understand the people. And interestingly, what you often see at citizens' assemblies is that populist citizens, they believe that the selection of expertise is biased and that other experts need to be added. Experts that basically are able to present the views of them and the good people. It's not that they are against expertise and experts per se. They just want a different group of experts. That's also something that we see visible in political parties and in Italy, for instance, whereby the Five-Star Movement also basically put forward an expert to the government. And that's something that you often see. Populist parties tend to have close links with certain experts that they trust and are close to the party. All right, and then there's the element of the practice of deliberation, because obviously, in theory, there might be all these positive effects of deliberation, but in practice, this is also nested in a reality whereby people are there. It's not just that populist parties react to the work of citizen assemblies. It's also that facilitators sometimes work well or don't perform well. And they might, for instance, cut off citizens, giving populist citizens the impression that they are not heard, not taken seriously. So in practice, it might backfire. And then there's obviously also the possibility of politicians being present at the citizens' assembly. Typically, politicians open these citizens' assemblies. They give a talk about how they are going to seriously consider the outcome and the advice of the citizens' assembly. And at the end, they typically also they are there physically to receive the recommendations of these citizens. Now, how these politicians behave there might have an impact that is positive or negative, depending on how authentic and trustworthy they are in their behavior and how they are perceived. So, theory and practice. It seems complicated. So this is something that obviously is the perfect setting for empirical research. Specifically, what we did is we tested 3 hypotheses in our work. The first is a very simple one, a direct effect. And that just expects that when populist citizens participate in citizens' assemblies or deliberative democratic innovations, they become less populist. So basically, the treatment works, or have a little faith in deliberation. But then we also try to go deeper and investigate to what extent this is mediated by the quality of these discussions, the deliberations, and basically how the other citizens viewed the populists. A second pathway or mediation effect was about the organization, the politicians, the civil servants that organize the citizens' assembly, and basically their behavior, and how basically the effect of participation changes depending on how the civil servants and the politicians behave themselves. What we did in practice was that we basically studied participatory budgeting cases where you have light deliberations and discursive moments, and citizens' assemblies. We did both quantitative and qualitative research. There was a lot of grunt work involved, as I told you already. Basically, when the session opened, people went through the door and they were immediately ambushed by me and my team, and they were handed paper surveys. And before they were allowed to leave, they got another paper survey that they had to fill in. So basically, the difference between the 2 surveys, because they were linked with each other, the only thing that happened between filling in the 2 surveys was that participatory budgeting or citizens' assembly session. Now, we also combined this statistical analysis and the survey data with interviews. And to me, that was something that was the most valuable, because we found a lot of things in the survey data that were impossible to explain simply by the data itself. And here, the interviews came in very handy. So regarding participatory budgeting, we had 3 municipalities. Why? Because participatory budgeting typically is carried out at a local level. We surveyed people there. We interviewed populist and non-populist citizens. So within the paper survey, there was a question, are you willing to be interviewed? Which is interesting because then we could also select interviewees based on their answers on the populism battery questions. And that is new. And there is a reason why there's hardly any qualitative research on populist citizens, because it's not that people have on their head a sign saying, I am populist. And you need survey data to measure the degree of populism and then linking that to interview data. So that was very nice. And we basically had, in total for the participatory budgeting and also the citizens' assemblies, roughly 70 interviews, of which 35 were with populist citizens. So for the citizens' assemblies, that is something that is organized at a higher level as well. So we have a local one, a provincial one, and now we are doing the National Climate Citizens Assembly study as well. All right, 7 findings from all of these studies. The first one is that if you analyze all of the studies, it's just the studies about participation in democratic innovations, what you see is that there is a lot of scientific herding going on, which is basically just fancy wording to say that we scientists tend to be totally hypnotized by citizens' assemblies and tend to ignore, for instance, participatory processes. However, if we look at the data of all of these studies, what we find is indeed that citizens' assemblies specifically largely deliver on their promises. So that is basically the first part on the effect of political attitudes. Yes, citizens' assemblies, it is found in the literature, they do have a positive impact on political attitudes. But what about populist attitudes? And here what we found in our study on the 3 participatory budgeting cases is that indeed participants with high populist attitudes get lower populist attitudes after participation in participatory budgeting. So participation lowers the degree of populist attitudes. However, it's not that simple. This is basically the main finding, but there are some important caveats to make there. The qualitative data, for instance, also found that it's not just that they perceive it differently, they have different glasses. The interesting thing is that non-populist citizens, they did not change their views. So for non-populist citizens, they did not become more populist, which is, I guess, also good news. And that is because it was specifically the populist citizens who paid a lot of attention to, indeed, as expected, what their other fellow citizens were saying and whether they were taken seriously or not, and all of the actions of the organization. Basically, the actions of the organization were put under the microscope, and they were very attentive to that. They also entered the room in a very skeptical way, a wait-and-see approach. Whereas the non-populist citizens, they were super happy, and they were very happy that they were invited and that they had the opportunity. They were positive. Now, as we said, the relation with the authorities was very important. And in all of the 3 cases, that was considered to be a positive thing. And that is also because it was organized in a way that was good. And here, we only studied, obviously, 3 cases. And as it happened, in all of the 3 cases, it went well. However, there were, in all of the 3 cases, there were moments where the process could have derailed. There were problems with the procedures. The politicians said some strange things. But all of these moments were saved, as in the organization responded and listened to the participants and changed its view. So it was very responsive to the participants. Now, that is not a given and also suggests that this can go wrong. And it's not like you like a deterministic relationship. As soon as you enter the room as a populist, that poof, magically you become less populist. No, it really depends on how people behave during these sessions. It turned out that the broader society of these municipalities, because we also surveyed a sample, a representative sample of the inhabitants of these 3 cities, it turned out that populists among the maxi public who did not participate were less willing to accept the outcomes of these participatory budgeting processes. And this also makes clear that if they participate, it can have a positive effect, but it does not necessarily translate to the populists in the broader population or the maxi public there. Now, this effect is mediated by two factors that actually are very important for practitioners. So, if these populist citizens recognize themselves in the participants, and basically this idea of they are people like me or like you, then they were more willing to accept the outcomes. And that is an important one that also has practical implications, because obviously if you as a practitioner organize these things, it's important to also show who is there. Photographs, whatever, interviews. And then I want to give you two main findings of our research on citizens' assemblies. And specifically, this is based on a climate assembly. And that is relevant because the gray box in the lower left corner talks about climate skepticism. Obviously, this is because it was a citizens' assembly on climate change. And here I think that the juicy bit, and I know that we scientists tend to show just these crazy models with very small numbers that people are unable to read. So the main number is this one. And what does that mean? It's a negative number. There's 2 stars. That means the populist citizens who participated became less populist. Okay, that's the good news. But again, the climate skeptic citizens actually became more populist after this session that centered on deliberation. This is something that we did not expect, and also you can't explain that based on the survey data. So here we had to revert to the qualitative interviews. And the interviews revealed that specifically what went wrong there was that in the first session, people were asked to stand up if they were vegetarians, if they had solar panels, if they had isolation and isolated their houses properly. Or basically, what these interviewees said, the climate skeptic ones, what they said was, we felt pressured. We felt that there was only one right answer, and that we were basically part of a process that served to legitimize stronger climate action. And as a result, they became more negative, more critical about the organization and about politicians. And their populist attitudes, specifically the anti-establishment and anti-elitist dimension, became higher. And here what you clearly see is that to a certain degree, this is also a thermometer about the integrity of how these processes are organized. It's not a magic bullet. It's not that automatically participants become less populist, but if it's a process whereby it's a bit of fake participation, then it is people, specifically the climate skeptics and people who are in the minority regarding a certain outcome, that might become more populist. And this is something that is often overlooked in research, whereby it is often said, if it has no positive effect, it has no effect. But obviously, it can also have a negative effect. In this case, that means making people more populist. So thank you very much. And as usual, I'm expecting that there will be questions.
Thank you so much, Nenad. That was fascinating. And I tend to also to agree with...
It was Kristof, not Nenad.
Oh, sorry. I'm doing too many things at the same time, so I get confused.
We do look very much alike, given the color of our shirts.
Exactly. No, thank you so much, Kristof. I was just writing down a question to Nenad. That's why I got confused. Thank you so much, Kristof. I mean, I think you're really quite right. I think it's still true today that we lack, in a way, knowledge of populist citizens and how they, in this case, particularly interact in citizens' assemblies. And let me open the floor immediately with a couple of questions, and then I suggest we open the floor to the participants. There are some 30 participants still left. First to Kristof, one thing that has always struck me in analysis of populist attitudes is that I'm not sure whether measuring populist attitudes is always particularly accurate. Meaning questions like, do you feel that politicians tend to be corrupt, or that politicians should listen to people's voices? I've never really understood why is that populist. So I wonder what are the hurdles that you see there? To what extent are we actually able to fully capture populist attitudes? And the second question, I think, is even more closely related to, let's say, the practice of assemblies. To what extent are we actually able to select and have the more radical populist citizens willing to participate? And I'm also asking this because with Citizens Take Over Europe, or with CitiDem as part, Citizens Take Over Europe basically was born to focus on the Conference on the Future of Europe. And we've been closely monitoring that, and there were very, very few citizens that were actually Eurosceptic, anti-European integration, etc. So I wonder what your views are there and how you see that in terms of having citizens' assemblies in a way addressing the populist question. There are many other questions I would have, but I don't want to dominate our discussion. By the way, my first question was also indeed put in the chat by Anat. For Nenad, my maybe a bit of a nasty question. I mean, most of us suffer from theorizing on the basis of our own context. And so in your case, my question would hence be, to what extent is the Swiss experience, is it transferable? Is it relevant for other cases? If it is, how do you think in more pragmatic terms that some of the practices that have a long history of experience in the Swiss context, how could we best promote these in other contexts? And how could we tailor them to very different circumstances? Like, I mean, not every country in Europe, for instance, is federal. And if they're federal, they're not federal like in the Swiss way, etc. So these are just two opening questions, but let me also allow participants to open their video. And I would say, I hope this works. People can put their hands up if there are questions.
Just a practical question. So when do you want us to answer the questions? After a round of questions of the participants in the webinar?
Yeah, but I don't see any hands up, so maybe there's something. Oh, there's a hand up. Yeah, so let's gather a couple of questions. There's Peter Stone, a good colleague and friend. Let's have a couple of questions, if that's okay for you, and then we go back to the speaker so you can properly respond. Peter, please go ahead. Or I have to unmute you, I'm afraid. There you are. Does that work? You should be able to unmute yourself.
Did that work?
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, thank you. Thank you. This has been fascinating. One question for Nenad. I think the discussion of the Citizens Initiative review is really interesting in this context. But I was wondering, isn't, on this question of like, should the results of the review vote be revealed? And I found isn't there something a little ironic in this case about trying to combat populism with one of these Citizens Initiative reviews if you're not revealing the vote? Because doesn't that kind of sort of occlude or fog over the differences of opinion that remain within the Citizens Review in exactly the kind of way that anti-populists would like to stress that yes, difference is a real thing, and it might even persist in a Citizens Initiative review. So if the outcome in that sense is not revealed, doesn't that sort of cloud over that in some way?
Thanks so much. Let us see if there's someone else who wants to jump in. If not, we go back to the speakers. I would say, Nenad, please go ahead.
Okay, so let me address, both Peter's question and your question, Paul, briefly. Great questions. Well, Peter, yes, this is something I've been asking also myself, and actually, what happened is before we organized our very first Oregon model CIR mini public in 2019. It was I think a few months before there was an ECPR Democratic Innovation Sessions in which I asked, there were many experts in the field in the room, and I said, we've been we have this dilemma: should we include the vote or not include the vote? And then most experts in the room, I don't want to quote them now because they're not here, but really people working in the field of mini public democratic innovations, they said, "Oh, don't include it," because for many reasons, especially the fact that then the attention of the media and of voters would focus too much on only this small piece of information, whereas the idea is that they read actually the statement and the deliberation, the result of these deliberations, the arguments in favor, the arguments against, and then make up their own mind. I always thought that this information should be included, and I still think it. But again, at the same time, we couldn't have done these experiments in Switzerland with the CIR model. So again, 5 of them until now. Plus, we did other mini publics without connection to referendums. But those connected with referendums, we wouldn't have received the authorization by public authorities to send this piece of information to citizens, because it would reveal some kind of preference for one or the other side. And these were really legal issues. But legal issues aside, I still think that there might be a case for, let's say, for this anti-populist potential of mini publics if connected with referendums, in a sense that if ordinary citizens receive this statement with the arguments in favor, arguments against, written not by the government, not by the lobbies, but by other ordinary citizens, they might have more faith or more trust in this piece of information, that the arguments are more balanced, and that in the end, if the mini public did its work properly, if they fact-checked the information, they wouldn't include in the arguments of either side information that typically come from, well, populist leaders, which are based, on fake news or, partially true information or whatever. So I haven't elaborated too much on that, but I think that there is some, one could make the case that there is a still anti-populist potential in many publics, even if the information on how the mini public itself voted on the proposal is not included. Paul, the question about, what can we take from other contexts and insert in? Well, it's always, I know that there is a skepticism about this, and I know that very often you say, oh yes, but you cannot compare Switzerland, and you cannot take the Swiss experience and export it. Well, I have a more nuanced view of that. I think no country has been born with democracy or direct democracy, whatever kind of democracy. Usually it was a process of not necessarily copy-paste, but getting inspiration from other cases. So if you read the Federalist Papers, you will find many references to Swiss ancient Landsgemeinde democracy, to ancient Greek democracy. So they got inspiration from there. Actually, the Oregon, the state of Oregon and other US states, they got inspiration from Swiss cantons in the late 19th century when they decided to implement direct democracy referendums, Oregon, California, and these US states. So, or again, the Swiss in 1848, when the current institutions of Switzerland were, federal constitution was actually written, they really used the American model of bicameral parliament and said, okay, let's do the same thing in Switzerland. So now we have the Swiss Council of State, that's its name, which is basically a copy of the US Senate. So these things can travel from one country to another. Of course, you need to be, to pay attention to the context, but I'm much more optimistic to the extent in which, you can get, some positive insights from other countries and try to implement it in a context that might seem completely different. And let me just conclude on this. One mini public in which I was directly involved in was in my home country, which is Bosnia and Herzegovina. So 2 years ago, we organized a mini public with 50 randomly selected people on the issue of constitutional reforms, electoral, and it was absolutely amazing in how, in such a very, you could say, divisive context, there was a war 30 years ago and so on and so on. Ordinary citizens from all ethnic groups were absolutely capable of discussing in a very civilized manner and actually come up with concrete recommendations that were, I must really say, excellent from the point of view of their quality, without that, myself or other colleagues, would suggest solutions. But it was really amazing to see something like that work in a context which is, completely different from the Swiss context. And I happen to know very well both of them. And so again, I do have a little bit more, hope that these democratic innovations are not always and not only context dependent, that they can travel from one country to another.
Thanks so much. Yeah, we could go on this aspect, of course. One thing that I seem to be learning from you is that, as you also, I think, you state in your work, is that the Swiss context, and as you mentioned also in the presentation, works not least because there's a frequent usage of certain instruments like direct democratic instruments. And that then also, of course, begs the question, how do you get these types of practices institutionalized? Because as we all know, citizens' assemblies, mini publics, etc., in most cases tend to be ad hoc sort of balloons of local initiators, but they're not really structurally part of the system. And in that sense, I would also be extremely interested, but I don't expect anyone to answer on this, but okay, if you then take, for instance, the Californian case, do we see something right now where that history of experimentation shows a certain amount of capacity of resistance, etc., to the current government? That would be interesting, I think, to explore. Kristof, it's your turn, I suppose.
All right, thank you. Very interesting discussion indeed. Thanks for the questions, Paul. So there is a big debate, obviously, in the literature on populist attitudes and populism among people and how to measure that, because it's very difficult indeed. And I think one of the key starting points is that it's this combination of elements that is important. It's not because somebody is against the government that he or she is automatically populist. No, they could, for instance, also be in favor of expert government. So being against the elite or against the government is not enough. It's the combination of anti-establishment, but also believing in the power of the good people and having this really black and white Manichaean worldview whereby the elite is not just you're against it, no, they are corrupt. And the act of politics is by itself corrupting. And that is why they also forgive populist politicians who are corrupt. For instance, in the case of Trump. Because the act of doing politics is corrupting. It's just that that populist politician in this case, is fighting for us. So we don't blame the corruption. Now, this combination of factors, there's a couple of scales that try to capture that for citizens. There's many different ones. There are at least 6 that are prevalent and often used. And in a recent survey study applying these across different contexts by Bruno Castaño Silva and colleagues, it turned out that there is no single scale or type of measurement that works everywhere. So you really have to be careful. And so the one that we use is the Ackermann et al. Scale. And that works if you're just studying one country, because it's really bad at comparing populism across countries, specifically when there are populists in office and other countries where they are not in office. And so depending on the type of study that you do, you need to also, well, basically choose another scale. So there's no single best scale that works everywhere. And I think it's very important to be conscious about this as a populism scholar. Then regarding it's a really fascinating question, once again, regarding do we get the populists there? And that's a fascinating one. And we compared populism among the maxi public and among the mini public to see if it's the same people, the same type of people. And it turns out that, fascinatingly, in the case of participatory budgeting, but it turns out that it's very similar people indeed. So the populists are there, but all of the usual biases also apply there. So these are a specific type of populists that tend to be there. Now, the interesting thing about populism is that it's a double-edged sword. So I can understand, for instance, that it's very difficult to get them to participate in a European mini public, because really they tend to be really skeptical about the organizers. And you have to convince them that they will be taken seriously. And somehow, I think for the European Union, that's even more difficult than for a national government or a local government. Local government's probably the easiest. Because specifically populists, but also skeptics, and the die-hard, really hardcore climate skeptics, for instance, they want to be heard. And there's this correlation between this idea that you really want to voice yourself rather than to exit from the process and having these attitudes. So there is this one thing that stimulates them to participate, but also the one that holds them back, and that is a skepticism regarding the organization.
Thank you. Fascinating, really interesting. I also very much like what you said about you need kind of scales, etc., that are contextually sensitive. That makes an awful lot of sense to me, and it might also be something we might think about in the CitiDem and in other related projects. One thing that just strikes me is that, okay, so let's say we are convinced that deliberation, assemblies can help change populists their mind. And it was my thought was a bit triggered by what you just said, Kristof. On some topics, populist citizens would be much less interested, like exactly the EU. So, is there research, or do we know more about the specific type of topics that we could most effectively, in a way, use assemblies for, in order to address the populist problem? One thing that always strikes me is that there are so few assemblies on the democratic issue itself. What is democracy? Like, it seems to me, for instance, currently in the US, a lot of people seem not even to be fully aware of how human rights are very rapidly being eroding, etc. And so assemblies on democracy, on rights, etc., it seems to me, maybe should be more on the forefront. But this is just a suggestion. I see we have a hand up from Charlie Page, or Page. My pronunciation is probably a disaster, but please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. I was very happy to listen to those presentations when I know Nenad a little bit. I wanted to react because of the concept of populism. For me, empty populism is also dividing the society into two groups, the bad and the good. The bad are the populist, the good are the non-populist or the anti-populist. And I worked a lot with, for example, whistleblowers. And when you look at the path of whistleblowers, they need maybe 15, 20, 25 years until their quest is achieved. And in the meantime, those critics towards the leader elite, those things, they are considered could be considered as populist, but they are not. The same for investigative journalists. I mean, I think those deliberative processes, they should be neutral. like you said, Kristof, about the climate assembly, those people who were stuck with it, they didn't want to take part in a good way, in a good mood, because they had the feeling the process was not neutral. And I think it's the most important thing. Then you have the fact to check whether this is a wrong argument or a good argument. And yeah, I took part also in Switzerland once, and it's amazing how people are able to sort it out by themselves. And I don't understand why we have to put this thing that it should be anti-populist, because I think it makes the process not so much neutral like it should be. What do you think about it?
Thank you so much. I don't see other hands up, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah, maybe Kristof or Nenad, if you want to respond to the issues just raised, sort of populism, anti-populism, and maybe also to what I sort of asked about what are the best topics, and maybe also the most urgent topics, if we think about assemblies and deliberation as some kind of response to indeed, let's maybe not call it even populist position, but anti-democratic types of positions and views.
Yes, well, I'd be happy to take this one, and Nenad, if you want to be my guest. So regarding the topics, there's not a lot of research here. I mean, let's be honest. Regarding participants, there's only very few studies about that. So that's clearly an agenda for future research. Regarding citizens' assemblies on democracy, it would make sense that this is a topic that is very important for populists, because they have a very clear view about what the ideal democracy is. It is one where the voice of the people is central and the power grab by the corrupt elites is mediated, basically. So they have very strong feelings about this, and I would expect that specifically for that kind of topic, they would be more willing and more likely to participate. But as I said, it can only be a hypothesis right now. Regarding other topics, that depends on the type of populist, and we know that these are empty signifiers, as they say. The people, what is the people specifically? Who are the elite? For left-wing populists, that's more likely to be, for instance, bankers. For right-wing populists, that might be politicians, but also civil servants working in immigration, the deep state. So it's different depending on what they call then the host ideology. And here, I think salient topics like climate and immigration for different types of populists might be the kind of topic that they turn up for. So that's my first hunches there. But it's nothing more than first hunches. Then regarding dividing into groups, yeah, definitely, Charlie, that is what populism does. And interestingly, what you see in the political science literature on populism is that the conception of populism is far more neutral than in the public discourse. And specifically when it comes to citizens. So for politicians, there tends to be this general agreement that populist parties, they might be a corrective to democracy, but most often they are actually a threat. And that's also because the populism, it's very, I mean, even if you have that they might strengthen electoral democracy, but rather decrease civil liberties, what we see in practice is that when push comes to shove and they risk losing the majority, they also erode the electoral liberties. So for populist politicians, I think the empirical consensus is that they're not positive for democracy on the whole. But for citizens, actually, and you rightly point to this example, they can actually be a thermometer showing things that went wrong in the process. So it's very worthwhile to listen to them carefully and take them seriously, because they can tell us something about the quality of the process and the integrity of the process. Moreover, what we also see is that these populist citizens specifically, they tend to be very energetic. They have a lot of energy, a willingness to change. There is this hope also included that they can make a difference. So they are not just angry, they also tend to be energetic. And once you get them on board and show that the process is neutral, they can really also bring that energy to the table. So I would not just indeed consider this to be something negative. It also has this positive impact.
Thanks so much, Nenad, please.
Yes, very briefly, Charlie. So for the people in the audience, Charlie was involved in our very first DemoScan experience in Sion, so he knows the Oregon model from very close. Now the question of I did put in my first slide, I think, on populism, there is a sentence saying that populism does not necessarily need to be something negative in democracy for many reasons that Kristof also mentioned. But to be very clear on the fact that it's true that in this webinar we are using the term anti-populist as negative. Why? Because we do think that certain populist leaders who are elected thanks to popular support, we should not forget that, if they tend to dismantle gradually the very democratic institutions that thanks to which they could be actually elected, well, that is a problem. And I think that on this particular issue, at least myself, I don't know, other people in the room, I don't play, the impartial game, everybody. No, this is the threat. We see it in the US. And I think that this kind of seeing, let's say, anti-populist attitudes as something that we should have is something that I absolutely share. And we see that it is a threat, not only in the US, we saw it in Hungary, in Turkey, in Poland, etc. So the kind of agenda they have is very clear, and that is a threat to kind of world that at least I would like to live in. And for that reason, I have no problem to say that yes, this kind of populists is problematic, more than problematic, and that explains perhaps why, at least in this talk, it is true, Charlie, we were using we were making perhaps the picture a little bit black and white, but there is a reason behind that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Charlie, is that an old hand that I still see floating up there, or? Okay. Okay, so we're getting close to the end, but it doesn't prevent me from asking you difficult questions. Because one thing that strikes me, we didn't talk about it that much, is what is actually how to put it, the disposition of populist leaders, parties, and movements themselves towards assemblies. That is, I know some examples, particularly on the, let's say, the populist left, where there is a certain affinity, at least recently so, towards assemblies as a potential method of democratizing, indeed. But on the other side of the spectrum, it seems to me what we see most of the times as the biggest threat, at least in Europe, that is, let's call it right-wing populism. There, it seems to me, there's much less interest in actually engaging with assemblies. Like, for instance, there was this organization in Poland, Ordo Juris, a think tank, very closely related to the Law and Justice Party. They monitored, just like CTOE, the Conference on the Future of Europe, but they came out with a much more negative assessment. Not that CTOE was necessarily very positive, but a negative assessment on how assemblies are maybe very problematic instruments if we really want to speak for the people. So I wondered, what are your views and your knowledge on how should we think about this? Because ultimately, in our countries, populists are increasingly showing electoral victories, right? So if one of the things we want to go ahead with is trying to get assemblies institutionalized, we better learn how to talk to these people, how to get them in some way on board, to make sure, indeed, that assemblies and other deliberative instruments become part of democracy as we still know it, if I may say it in a very dark way. I'm not sure if you have reflections on this. This is a bit on the at the end of our webinar today. It's almost 6:30, but I would love to hear your views on how should we look at the populist leaders and movements.
I have some thoughts on that. Again, just thoughts. I did an analysis of the reactions of La France Insoumise and Rassemblement National to the French Climate Assembly. And what you saw was basically what was most important for them was the outcomes. And if they liked the outcomes, they liked the process. And so given that the process or the outcomes were more in line with what La France Insoumise also wanted, they tended to be slightly more positive. However, on these elements where the Citizens Assembly's advice diverged from the party manifesto of La France Insoumise, they said, well, we were right, they are wrong. So it seems that this is all dependent on outcome favorability. Now, typically, the outcomes of Citizens Assembly, specifically on climate change, for instance, because there's been a lot on climate change, tend to be more left-wing, so to speak, rather than right-wing. So if this outcome favorability is the most dominant factor regarding support for the process, then it doesn't surprise me that Citizens Assemblies are more supported by left-wing populists than by right-wing populists. There's one example that I know of in the Netherlands. It's just an anecdote, whereby there was this unholy alliance of populist radical left and populist radical right parties at the provincial level pushing through a Citizens Assembly. And why was that? Because it was anti-political. And that's what they shared. And it was about a topic that was neutral, housing.
Okay, thanks so much. I think if you have something to add to this, Nenad, this might be... Look, okay, no, there's no example or maybe a reflection on how this plays out in the Swiss context.
Doesn't come up to my mind immediately, but perhaps one thing that I think it's important to, just to conclude, to distinguish between the Kristof's work, very, very important on populist attitudes and populists in many publics. And what I have quoted towards the end of my presentation is that I think it's one thing that to analyze how populist citizens, however you want to define them, how do they change during a mini public, even on a topic which is not necessarily a populist topic, participatory budgeting, and on the other hand, how people, and I would even say independently if they are populist or not populist, simply ordinary citizens react on a populist proposal. I mean, we do know that populists have, very, proposals which sound, very, perhaps easy to implement. Or let's say let's kick out all criminals from the country, whatever. Which is easy to say, difficult to implement because there are many, many other issues around, like what do you do with family members of these people? Do they also, get kicked out or not, etc. So it's one thing to analyze the changes within many public independently on the topic. It's another thing to focus on topics which we can classify as populist driven potentially. Let's ban the minarets, let's say, and then see how a mini public changes its opinion during the deliberation on that specific topic. So the studies that I quoted, Bechtiger and Grönlund and others, were more on that side and less on what Kristof and his collaborators have analyzed. If Kristof, you correct me if I'm wrong.
No, and I fully agree. It's very important to have these both strands separated because they study different things. Both are very interesting and very complementary. And to be frank, I think that there are just very few citizens' assemblies on these kind of topics. There are very few citizens' assemblies on migration. There's been two, if I'm not mistaken, in Austria, one in Germany, if I'm not mistaken. But very, very few. So most of these tend to be on non-populist topics. And in fact, bringing our two strands together, I would be super interested in studying populist citizens in a mini public about a populist proposal. I think that's super interesting. And really, that's where the litmus test is.
That's a great remark, I think. So, for instance, have an assembly and LGBTQI rights or so. And I mean, exactly, this might be extremely important to put people on the spot, so to speak. But anyhow, we went over time already. I mean, Well, first I wanted to, first of all, I want to thank the speakers for their really excellent contributions. And then, of course, also the participants and anyone who asked questions or interacted in the chat, etc. I'm sorry that I mixed up some stuff in the chat, but I think I corrected it again. I just wanted to put as a final message, indeed, our CitiDem project is ongoing, and so we have already a new a next webinar planned in 2 weeks' time, same place in a way, same time. And in this context, it's complementary to what we discussed today. We will address dimensions of militant democracy and whether that's in one way or the other necessary in the context of defense of democracy in current times. So thank you so much again. I hope you enjoyed this, and hopefully we meet soon again, either in presence in one way or the other, or otherwise again in the sort of the digital surrogate type of context. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paolo. Thank you, everyone.
Have a great evening.
Ci vediamo a Bologna, Paolo.
Speriamo. Sarebbe
presto.
bello. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.